Hey everyone, it's Theo from Spectrum Gardening. So today's really exciting for us. We're finally going to be filling our raised garden beds. While it may not typically sound like an exciting thing to do, you've got to realize that we were planning to fill them in December, and we had a machine booked to bring the soil from the front to the back. We had the 8 yards of soil here, 8 yards of manure in our trailer. And then it snowed over the weekend, 2 feet, and then it got another foot. And then at one point we were dealing with 4 feet of snow in our yard. So that happened in December, and now it's February. So it's almost 2 months later. So needless to say, we're excited. But before we get started on this project, I want to explain a couple benefits of the raised garden beds. So you can see I've got 4 of them here, and I've got a U-shaped over there with trellises all around it for the greenhouse. So one of the great things about the raised garden beds is because you can control the type of soil that you put in there. Meaning if you're growing on kind of like a fill type of quality of this type of soil right here, or your clay, you don't have to worry about amending it so much. You can just kind of plonk down a raised bed like this, and you can fill it with pretty much whatever you like. So in our case, we're going to be filling ours with manure and soil. However, before we did that, we did a previous video of how to install garden beds. And in that video, we featured that you should be putting cardboard down versus landscape fabric. There's a few different reasons for that, which I went in detail with that video. However, before we're actually filling up our garden beds with manure or soil, we've put a layer of leaves on top of the cardboard, as you can see right here. Now the leaves are going to act as a kind of a filler. They're also going to act as more food for the worms and the microorganisms, and they're going to break down. However, ideally you want to shred your leaves, or you want to use small ones like this. You want to try to kind of avoid using big ones or ones that aren't really cut up, because they're going to take a long time to break down. We're not really too concerned about that ourselves, because all the leaves are going to be at the bottom, and they're not really going to be on top of, like, we're not going to be using them as mulch or anything like that. There are a couple types of leaves you want to avoid, like black walnut and things like that, and cedar, because they're going to impede the growth of your plants, and they're not really going to break down, and they'll just cause problems in your soil. Now let's go take a look at the manure and the soil we're going to be using. For the past 2 months, this pile of manure is being actually frozen in the back of our trailer. And we haven't been able to either get it out or use the trailer because it was full of manure, full of shit. So it was actually just the other day that it was thawed enough that we could actually dump it out. But you can still see there's frozen chunks like this big guy right here and this one right here. It is thawing, and last night I did go through the whole pile with a shovel and with a pry bar. And in the middle of the pile, it's pretty much thawed. It's just kind of around the edges, which is still frozen. But when we're filling up the garden beds, we can just pull back the chunks, and we'll work with the thawed part. So the manure that we're using, we call it moo poo, because honestly, there's filters on Facebook preventing us from advertising and selling manure. So we use the name moo poo to get around the filters, and it's just kind of stuck. The manure that we use is actually from a dairy farm. So it's separated manure. Separated manure basically has had most of its water content and most of the nitrogen removed. So it's basically just organic fibers, as you can see. I will be putting a close-up of a picture of it after this clip, just so you have a better idea. It's just basically like the hay and the straw and all the feed that they've fed the cows. That's basically what it is. It's not going to be adding a whole bunch of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. There's going to be trace amounts of calcium in here also. We're basically using it as organic fill. We're using it as a way to kind of put more organic matter in our garden beds and to cut down the cost of our soil, to say it plainly. This pile of soil is around 8 yards or so. So we actually need about 14, 15 yards just to fill our beds. And this one's been sitting here for about 2 months also, but we've covered it with a tarp. That's to kind of prevent all the soil goodness and everything to be kind of washed away and just be kind of left with fill. And there was a small part of this pile that wasn't covered with a tarp, and I'll do a close-up of that one just so you can kind of see the difference. So if you take a look at this one right here, I will include some pictures. You can see it looks quite woody. That's because of all the little parts of the soil have kind of just washed away. This soil is made out of 30% peat moss, 30% mush manure, and it has some wood fibers and some sand in there too, some washed sand. It's a really nice mix. This is our regular soil blend, and this is what we use ourselves in our own garden beds. But we do amend it bi-yearly typically with either manure or cover crops. We find manure is easier for us because we don't have to till it in. So you can see that it looks woody here. Now let's take a look at the side that was covered. So if you take a look at here, it looks pretty dark and rich, and we're not seeing those wood fibers like what we did on the other parts. I will do a close-up of both sides just so you can kind of see the difference. Yesterday I started filling all the beds. However, I did get kind of tired. So after putting all the manure, raking it out, and starting on the soil, I kind of called it quits for the day. However, today we're going to finish up. So as you can see here, I've got some piles of soil in the front of this one, and that one over there. But let's take a closer look at the one that I've started to rake out a little bit. So you can see in here, I've basically filled it about halfway full of manure and about halfway of soil. Now, if this was typically like regular manure with lots of water content and a high nitrogen that would break down easily by itself, I would just leave it. However, since I explained earlier in the video that this has been separated, it's had the nitrogen and had the water removed from it. So it's basically organic matter. It's got low levels of nutrients, but nothing really that's going to help it break down a lot. But the thing is, it's really fluffy. It's really light. That's the thing. Like it's super light. It's just basically like fibers. And the soil, on the other hand, is heavier, like the way soil is. So what I'm going to be doing, once I get this bed totally filled right here, once that's all raked out, and once the other ones are done, I'll actually take my pitchfork and I'll mix it all. So then that way I've got good integration between the manure and the soil, and it's going to help. It's going to help the soil break. It's going to help the soil. The soil is going to help break down the manure a little bit more than it would by itself, just because of the nitrogen factor in the soil, and because it's going to be a more diverse things for all the worms and everything like that to eat. While it's not necessary really for me to mix the two products by hand. However, I want to make sure I've got really good integration because I don't want just this sitting on the bottom. I don't want to just like basically a thick layer of carbon or a thick layer of organic matter sitting on the carbon and only have about 8 inches or so for my soil. I've done a mixture like this before, and once I've done it here, I'll show you the finished product. I've mixed them together before, and I've got a really nice, light, fluffy soil mixture with manure, I guess, that the water not only flows through very nicely, but it holds moisture and it's super rich. So that's kind of why I'm doing it again on these beds, because I know what kind of result I'll get from mixing that. I've filled my beds and I've more or less leveled them out, but before I start mixing them, let's take a look at them. So you can see how beautifully the beds look with that nice rich soil on top of them. But you can also notice that I haven't filled them all the way up or overfilled them, because I need room to mix without having to worry about the soil kind of falling out while I mix. And then also afterwards, I know once they've all been mixed up, I'm also going to need to add more soil and more manure to them. So I've just kind of filled them part way now, and then after I'm finished mixing, I'll top them up with more manure and more soil. Before I top up the beds with more manure and more soil, I just want to kind of show how well or how unwell I mixed the bed. So you can see that there's some manure mixed with some leaves on the top, some leaves and stuff like that. But the mixture hasn't totally been flipped basically upside down, which I wasn't trying to do. I was only trying to kind of mix them up a little bit more, just so then they can the manure can be helped to be broken down a little bit faster, and it's not just going to be the kind of a thick layer on the bottom. With mixing it like this, and then when I top it up with more soil and more manure, I'm going to have a really nice, probably a good top 2 to 3 inches of just fluffy mixture. And the roots of the initial roots of the plants, the small roots from the lettuce or things like that, they're absolutely just going to love that rich soil I'm going to be providing them. So I've just finished filling up all the raised beds, and so let's take a look. So this is the inside of the greenhouse. It's not that interesting right now, it's just soil and manure basically. Our greenhouse is in a little bit of rough shape right now. We transported it on the back of our trailer, just whole like this, and we just strapped the whole thing down. And we drove about 45 to an hour distance on the highway with it. So it needs a little bit of love to get it back in shape, but that'll come in time. So let's check out these beds. So you can see on these beds here, on the previous pictures, I put a layer of manure, and then I put a layer of soil on top of that. The reason I did it like that is because I kind of want to sandwich the manure between the mixture of manure and soil and another layer of soil. And this one here has a little bit of manure just on top of it, just because it was on the ground as I was filling it and I just didn't want to waste it. So if you look at the beds, however, you can see that they're a little bit overfilled like this. They've got a little bit of like a hump on them. I did that purposely because I know how much organic matter is in the garden beds, that it's going to break down relatively quickly, and the soil level is going to drop quite a bit. So probably by the time I'm going to be planting, it's going to be either pretty much level or just above. But even if it's just above, I'm not too worried, because we water by drip irrigation, so it's not going to be overflowing from ahead and kind of washing out the soil. So I just talked about how I layered the manure and kind of sandwiched it between 2 layers of soil. I'm pretty sure that it's going to be relatively fine when I'm ready to plant. However, if it does need a little bit of mixture, what I'll be doing, I'll just be taking a rake and I'll just be kind of going this far into the soil because I really don't want to be tilling the soil, especially now that it's February and everything's kind of waking up in the soil. All the worms are becoming more active, all the bacteria, all the microorganisms. I don't want to be disturbing that a lot. I want to kind of let it do its own magic and kind of build my soil that way. So I'd only go down just a little bit and just kind of rake it kind of together like that. So I've talked a lot about how I use manure in my garden beds. I've done that because it helps lower the cost of filling my garden beds. My garden beds are 4 by 12 by 16 inches high. And by using manure to fill them up, I basically reduce the cost of soil for myself in half. So I've used separated manure like I've talked about. However, you can also use fresh manure, like manure that hasn't been aged or anything like that. The only thing with that is, if you're building a new garden bed and you're putting it in spring, you want to either mix the soil really well if it's fresh, and you want to just be using a little bit because it will cook your seedlings. It will cook your seeds. Or you want to put it in the winter or the late fall. And then put your soil on top of that and put a little bit of layer of manure on top of your soil to kind of act as mulch in that regard and kind of protect it from the snow, the elements, and the wind, and kind of blowing away. When applying manure, you have to be very careful. You only want to apply it 90 days before you harvest your above ground veggies. And I believe it's 120 days for like root veggies and things like that. That's just to make sure that you don't get sick from manure, because after all, it is animal poo. However, if you are looking to reduce costs on filling up your garden beds, you don't have access to manure, you can use yard trimmings. You can even use logs. So you just take like big tree branches, and you just layer them in the bottom, and then you get like your yard waste, your smaller branches, your leaves, maybe even some grass clippings, and you layer that on top, and then you put your soil on top of that, and that'll also help reduce your cost. So I just talked about putting a garden bed in the fall and the winter with hot manure on the bottom. That's actually the best time to install a garden bed. It's not the spring, it's not the late summer, it's not any of those times. The best times is actually early fall or early winter. The reason for that is because you could even overfill the garden beds, like even more than what I did in fall and in winter, and then it's going to settle over the winter, and then come spring when you're actually ready to plant, you just kind of top them up a little bit. And then since your soil is already there, your soil, your manure, or your yard trimmings, or whatever you basically put in your beds to fill them up, since it's already there, the worms and the microorganisms are going to get a jump start on it. They're going to be like, hey, I've got a home. I already have a home. I'm going to start being active. As opposed to putting it in let's say March, and then you're going to be going through all the growing season with basically a fresh soil with not much of an ecosystem in there. Installing raised beds in fall and winter is by far the best way to do it. That's actually what I recommend. A few reasons for that is just what I outlined. And also, people like me that build raised garden beds for a living, that's when we're the least busy. So your quote times are going to be way down, and you're going to get your product much faster, as opposed to I want to touch on the manure subject just quickly again. The manure that we use has had the water and the nitrogen removed. However, you can use cow manure, which we use. You can use goat manure, alpaca manure. You can use pretty much every kind. However, I highly recommend not using horse manure. The reason for that is because the horses don't really digest their food. The seeds and everything just go straight through them, so you're going to get a lot of weeds in your soil. By far, my favorite manure is goat. The reason for that is because you can basically take a goat to a blackberry patch, or you can take them to Japanese knotweed, or you can take them to bindweed. They'll eat it, and their stomach will actually kill everything, and you won't actually have any seeds that come out of the goat's digestive system, no matter how invasive the species is that they ate. If you have any questions or comments about this video, make sure to throw them in the comment section down below. And feel free to share how you fill up your raised garden beds. And don't forget to give us a thumbs up and to subscribe to our videos.